Today, Aleppo was liberated not only through the efforts of its people, but also by the hands of the sons of Homs, Damascus and Ghouta. They all united with one goal: to free this land from the regime. No one saw it coming. What started on November 27th, 2024 as an offensive in northwestern Syria quickly rolled across the country. Some efforts were made to push back the seemingly unstoppable momentum of the rebels' advance, but to no avail. Across the country, key towns and cities fell to opposition control, some with little resistance, others offering no resistance at all. On December 7th, Syria's Interior Minister took to state television to reassure citizens. He told reporters, "I assure citizens that there is a very strong cordon, both security and military, on the far outskirts of Damascus and Damascus countryside. No one, neither their operators nor their supporters, can penetrate this defensive line carried out by our courageous armed forces." 1 day later, rebel forces entered the Syrian capital of Damascus. Not battling through a very strong cordon, but through the remnants of a military, with posts abandoned and uniforms littering the streets. That interior minister who promised a strong defence was nowhere to be found, and it was soon understood that the president, Bashar al-Assad, and his family had fled the country. His brutal tyranny that started with his father in 1971, 54 years ago, was over. The rebels declared their victory on state television.
تم بحمده تعالى تحرير مدينة دمشق وإسقاط الطاغية بشار الأسد وإطلاق سراح.
The conquering hero, Ahmed al-Sham, the leader of the rebel group Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, was cheered as he addressed Syrians in the famed Umayyad Mosque.
هذا النصر يا أخواني تاريخ جديد للأمة الإسلامية بأكملها.
This victory, my brothers, is a new history for the entire Islamic nation. This victory, my brothers, is a new history for the region.
مزرعة للأطماع الإيرانية نشر فيها الطائفية.
On the first Friday of this new history, December 13th, thousands descended into Umayyad Square in Damascus to celebrate. But now, 2 months on, the parties are over. Syria has entered a new phase in its history and needs a new state. This week, who are Syria's new leaders? Are they the same group that ruled Idlib? How are the Syrian people engaging with their new country? And how can the country rebuild after everything it has experienced? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to the New Arab Voice. The events that led up to December 8th and the fall of the Assad regime was sparked by the offensive launched by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. They are led by Ahmed al-Sham, who previously went by the nom de guerre Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. Previously, HTS had settled in as the rulers of the northwestern province of Idlib and were one of the main opposition groups that still existed, along with the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army and the Kurdish-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces, as well as a myriad of other smaller groups. The Syrian civil war lasted 14 years, and during that time, HTS has presented itself in a number of forms.
So Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham has evolved ideologically and politically as well.
This is Joseph Dahir, an academic and expert on the political economy of the Middle East and Syria, and author of the book Syria After the Uprisings, The Political Economy of State Resilience.
It initially started in 2012, or the end of 2011, as Jabhat al-Nusra, which was at the time a part of the so-called Islamic State. Afterwards, they separated from so-called Islamic State to join al-Qaeda, and afterwards they also cut their ties with al-Qaeda.
Both the Islamic State and al-Qaeda have a bad reputation. Quite rightly so. Both groups are guilty of terrible crimes. In the immediate aftermath and in the days that followed, a number of people, particularly the supporters of the former Assad regime, declared that Syria was now ruled by extremist jihadi terrorists.
I believe that Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham has gone through major transformations, both ideologically and politically. This is connected also to the reality of what they had to deal with. They've been managing, governing territories in the northwest, mostly Idlib. They built institutions, and they have shown a lot of pragmatism. We can see as soon as 2020, Julani, known today as Ahmed al-Shara, declaring to Western journalists that his group would be ready to fight against other extremist political actors such as Daesh in the fight against terrorism.
HTS does have a history, and not a particularly pleasant history. In the past, they have associated with and been part of violent and deadly groups. They also govern the province of Idlib with a fairly strong fist, but also a fair degree of competency. During their rule, services generally continued as best as the conditions would allow, and when the COVID pandemic came to their area, they operated a successful vaccination program, far more competently than the Assad regime managed. It would probably be unfair to characterize the HTS of today as either Islamic State or Al-Qaeda.
This does not mean that it is a democratic, progressive organization. Far from it. It is an organization that now works into a national framework, which is Syria. Again, that is very pragmatic, but I think it is really important not to diabolize in many ways this organization, say it's still Al-Qaeda or Daesh. At the same time, it's definitely not anymore a transnational jihadist organization, but it is not an organization seeking the defense or the guarantee of democratic and social rights.
With the start of the revolution in 2011 came a set of ideals. The fall of the Assad regime was chief among them, but there was also a considerable constituent that wanted democratic freedoms, equal rights and representation, and a fair and just judicial system. The fall of the Assad regime was achieved. But for the rest, the country is still waiting to see what happens. Maybe HTS will be able to achieve this. Maybe they can't, or maybe they won't. For the time being, they have achieved the ousting of a hated dictator. This must surely add to the popularity of the group.
So it is quite sure that the organization benefits today from a certain level of popularity. Is this popularity meaning that it represents or would gather the majority of votes in future elections? I don't believe so. There's a lot of diversity, political diversity in Syria, while Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham is trying as much as possible to consolidate its power on state institutions, as well as gaining international legitimacy. It also suffers from criticism from the fact that it is trying to, in many ways, govern alone, and that there is not a sharing of power, or that other initiatives such as the National Dialogue Conference is not being organized in an inclusive way. So there definitely Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham benefits today from a revolutionary legitimacy by the fact that it played the leading role militarily in the fall of the Assad regime. This said, there are also criticism against its lack of inclusivity, democracy, against Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham.
The fall of the Assad regime came suddenly, very suddenly. From the start of the HTS offensive to rebel groups entering Damascus, it was less than 2 weeks, and almost bloodless. But in a sense, it hasn't happened suddenly. Since the start of the revolution in 2011, many Syrian people have been thinking about what sort of political representation they may want, who they want governing them, what form of government they want. Previously, talking openly about alternatives to the Assad regime risked imprisonment, torture, and death. But not anymore.
Now what we're witnessing in Syria is a surge of political dynamism. especially focused in Damascus. Damascus today can witness around 3 or 4 conferences per day. Unfortunately, we don't have the same level of dynamism in other regions of Syria for different reasons, whether security, such as in Homs or rural areas of Homs, or the coastal areas. In the south, you do have also political activities, but in areas such as Sueda, that is outside of the control of Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham.
Part of this political dynamism is excitement and Syrians seizing a chance to create something new and better than what came before. And part of it likely comes from HTS being unable to put the democratic cat back in the authoritarian bag.
And at the same time, despite the willingness of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to consolidate its power on political institutions, military institutions, it still doesn't have the military and human capacities to govern on the whole of Syria, which allows a political space to develop. So today you do have demonstrations, whether for political demands regarding, for example, a more inclusive national dialogue conference or the fate of the political prisoners and the disappeared, but as well on socio-economic issues. For example, state employees that have been laid off by the new government are protesting against these procedures, and we can witness major demonstrations. That said, the political scene is still being constructed and built. There are attempts to build various types of democratic coalition, progressive coalition. They've been the establishment of various networks, such as the Syrian Democratic Gathering, that have been trying to organize in different regions on democratic and socio-economic issues. You have different political groups going from the leftist spectrum to more liberal on the right.
Political thought and discussion is alive in Syria, although, as Joseph mentioned, mostly active in Damascus. In other parts of the country, there remains a complex situation, with security concerns, violence, and opposition to HTS. Such political engagement is understandable when you remember the previous intense restrictions and also the serious issues that are facing the Syrian people today.
So just prior to the Assad regime falling, just a couple of months ago now, about 90% or more of the population was under the poverty line.
This is Natasha Hall, a senior fellow with the Middle East programme at the Centre for Strategic International Studies.
But the situation was so bad, in fact, that I doubt we actually know the real figures. In regime-controlled areas in particular, humanitarian access was fairly grim. Sort of needs assessments and things like that were probably not entirely accurate and were tampered with. So we don't actually know. But today, sort of humanitarian needs are woefully under-provided for.
Life in Syria is extremely difficult, and it's been difficult for many years now. The people living there are experiencing problems, compounded with issues, multiplied by complications. And while the fall of the regime is welcomed, the Assad family did not take all the country's problems with them when they fled to Moscow.
It's wonderful that there's a lot of Syrian diaspora and European actors, even American actors that are coming into the country. They're spending money when they're there. People are excited that they're spending money. They need the foreign currency reserves. They need the liquidity. But the problem is that's primarily in major cities. So we have a similar situation that we had prior to the revolution, where there's going to be a growing divide between Damascus and sort of middle class, upper middle class people, and then the rest of Syria, essentially. And so if something isn't done relatively quickly, I think, to shore that up, we're going to see, I think, more suffering, more instability.
Aid organizations can help and should help in Syria. Previously, aid organizations had to contend with complex and often dangerous internal borders between regime and rebel-held territories, as well as the heavy taxation, corruption and theft that came along with doing aid work in Syria. Without these internal borders, the delivery of aid should be easier.
I think that's one of the big issues, because aid is not going to save Syria. It is not meant to save any kind of country, especially not humanitarian aid. But in this case, you could have investors, you could have the World Bank and IFIs coming in to help with much larger amounts of money, infrastructure, salaries, development grants, these kinds of things that are really needed to get the economy off the ground. And you're just not seeing those shifts take place yet.
Aid is desperately needed. It can help ensure that a family won't go hungry. But that's pretty much the limit of humanitarian aid. It's unlikely to provide the job that allows for a breadwinner to earn enough money to provide for a future and not to be reliant on aid.
There is a real crunch right now at possibly the worst time for Syria. It is a time of euphoria and optimism, but simultaneously, you're not really seeing the actual policies move forward fast enough to fill the vacuum.
Both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank could put money into Syria to help draw the country off a reliance on aid. But as Natasha Hall says, they're not.
I mean, there's a lot of reasons. The board, I know, at the bank in particular, at the World Bank, had been split for many years on whether or not to really invest in Syria. Now I think that there's more serious discussions going on, but I think it will take some time for something like a World Bank loan to a country like Syria. There had been much smaller proposals, like from the Climate, Adaptation Fund and things like that over the years, but we're talking about pennies compared to the billions of dollars that's needed.
Syria is going to need a lot of help, which might not be coming immediately. For the time being, it will be Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham who have formed a transitional government and who will be responsible for creating a state. Well, in part creating a state. Joseph Tahir again.
The political power before relied on Bashar al-Assad. The military power was in the hands of Maher al-Assad and the 4th Brigade, and the economic power was in the hands of Asma al-Assad, affiliated with Maher al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. This has gone.
Prior to December 8th, the Assad family and the small circle around them represented the core of Syria's power base. This has fallen away. Completely. But the stuff outside the core, that still remains.
So what we have now is Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham taking over, if you want, states institutions, such as the Ministry of Health, Education, etc. But all the core military institutions have vanished. This is why Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham established a new army, in which it's mostly composed today of its own soldiers and of the pro-Turkish Syrian National Army, integrating key military commanders from the Syrian National Army. Similarly, we had the establishment of a new security service department that is directed by a close ally of Ahmed al-Shari. But when it comes to other state institutions, Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham has just designated new leadership, while state employees, for the most of them, for the ones that have not been laid off, have remained nearly the same. But some institutions lack public state employees, especially if we look at health, education, ministries.
As would be expected, and very likely demanded by the Syrian people, parts of the government will change significantly. For other parts, it will be more akin to removing the pictures of Bashar al-Assad and changing the flag on the top of the building. While HTS may be a transitional authority, they will be responsible for creating a state, or at least creating a system strong enough to see the country through until a constitution can be drawn up and elections held.
I believe that Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham and Ahmed Sharia are very pragmatic. Their core objective today is not to establish an Islamic state or an Islamic form, if you want, of governance. The main objective of Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham and Ahmed Sharia today, again, is to consolidate their own power on Syrian state institutions, society, and to seek regional and international legitimacy, which will help them in their first objective that I mentioned, to consolidate its power. So I believe they could, on certain aspects, make concessions.
This pragmatism was seen in Syrian schools. Previously, children would be provided with lessons and textbooks that praised Assad and the regime. These were obviously done away with, and in their place a much more Islam-centric and conservative curriculum was put in place. This prompted an intense backlash, and amid this backlash, the decision for a more conservative curriculum was reversed.
But moreover, I believe that whether a more inclusive Syrian army, whether a more inclusive democratic society will be the result of the balance of forces. If there is a sufficient and strong civil society, again, in its larger meaning, outside only of NGOs, but trade unions, democratic groups, to impose a balance of forces in its favor, Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham will have to make concessions. Otherwise, there's a risk that cannot be completely put aside or ignored of new forms of civil confrontations or armed confrontations, without saying potential civil war, if there's a complete refusal from Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham to be more inclusive or to be more authoritarian.
Following the fall of the Assad regime, there were two main winners. First and foremost, the Syrian people. A brutal dictator who had previously defied all the odds was removed from power. Secondly, Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham. They were the force that launched the offensive that resulted in Assad being removed from power. When a new constitution is drawn up and elections held, it's not unreasonable to believe that HTS will run for office. They will not be content with being caretakers alone. They believe themselves to be the victors, and that some of the spoils are owed to them. Transitional President Ahmed al-Shara has said that it will take 4 years for a new constitution and elections to be held.
How long does the writing of a constitution take? How long will, is it possible to organize elections? Are important questions, especially that you have areas today that it's nearly impossible to organize elections. Some areas are outside of the control of Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham. Would they accept elections? On what kind of law? Today, what's happening, for example, in Homs and rural areas of Homs, you have security campaigns led by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, which are committing crimes against civilians based on sectarian identity. How do you want to organize tomorrow elections in these areas? Or if we talk about the writing of a constitution, who will be the people to be selected? Are people from other areas being able to participate in it according to security issues? These are numerous questions. But moreover, I believe it's not the issue of time or the duration. Obviously, we can put question, 3 years, why 3 years, why 4 years, why 5 years? But the key question is, why is Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham deciding alone, and on what basis? I think this is the key issue regarding any future elections, the establishment of a new constitution, is the lack of inclusivity in the process. And this is what is bringing criticism.
When elections do happen, whenever that might be, it would be democratically healthy if HTS wasn't standing unopposed. An opposition will be needed. But again, the socio-economic situation does come into play here. Who is going to be concerned with political philosophy and constitutional arguments when they struggle to put food on the table for their children? Natasha Hall again.
I haven't heard a lot about creating opposition parties just yet because they're not really sure what to be opposed to. It's unclear what the future will be. And I think with regards to, kitchen issues versus political philosophy or constitutional issues, I think it's a bit of both, and depending on who you talk to. There's always going to be, the masses of people who are, like in the United States here or anywhere else, are more concerned with putting food on the table and whether or not they're going to be able to pay their next electricity bill. And then there are those that, do sit around in cafes and discuss what the new constitution will look like and who should form the national dialogue and all of these issues that I do think actually feed into those other socioeconomic issues later down the line. I have seen a willingness with this transitional government to bring a wide range of actors that I have been working with over the years, from Syrian civil society to the table, which is very heartening. And we've seen that with the national dialogue that's recently been put together of 7 individuals. Some people have not liked the setup because it does not include Kurds or Alawis or Druze. But you do have some pretty serious people. It would be better, obviously, if it was more inclusive. But I think a lot sort of remains to be seen.
The issue of representation and inclusivity is another serious issue facing both the people of Syria today and the prospect for future Syrian political movements and governance. Syrian society is a patchwork of different religious groups, many of whom were pitted against each other as a means of control by the former Assad regime, and during the civil war, where groups were formed on sectarian lines.
I mean, one of my biggest fears is we do have that representation within governance, but there's no real power to that representation. It's easy to throw a Christian or a Kurdish person on a board or in a national dialogue conference, but that person to have, almost no power. What we don't want is sort of window dressing for inclusiveness. I do think, having kind of like a Bill of Rights, if you will, or something ensuring the protection of minorities is so important at this moment. Because the reality is, if you want democracy or something like that, it's going to be fairly difficult for a religious minority to get a substantial number of seats. Now, obviously, the way that the Constitution is drafted, the way that the elections proceed when they do, will in large part, try to define what inclusiveness looks like. But the good thing is that they're not starting from square one. I mean, Syrians themselves are not starting from square one. There are myriad organizations that have been working on this for 14 years. I mean, I'm on the board of an organization called The Day After. Just a year ago when we were meeting, we were trying to discuss whether or not we should change the name. And here we are, it's The Day After. So there is this huge opportunity. And I think we're not starting at square one, but I think certainly a lot of those initial plans will have to be amended somehow, because no one could have possibly imagined that this is what the day after would look like.
And Joseph Tahrir.
The most important issue is not to believe that minorities in Syria are separated from the wider Syrian society. And we have to be careful talking about minority rights after they were separated from the vast majority of the Syrian population. There's a necessity to speak more of an equal citizenship model in which the diversity of Syria is represented. In this perspective, the current Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham has made several statements to guarantee the fact that all Syrians will be treated equally, regardless of their religious or ethnic backgrounds. Now, when it comes to the practice, there's still very much a lot of questions, especially if we look at the security campaigns led by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham in Homs, rural Homs, and coastal areas that has targeted Alawite population, and not only former regime representatives, officials. We have witnessed violation of human rights against civilians because basically they were Alawites. So this is our sources of concern and should be definitely condemned.
There is a fine line to walk in. There are genuine fears among minority groups in Syria. The Christians of Syria fear Islamic rule in the country, and Syria's Alawite community, who are much favoured by the former Assad regime, fear persecution and retribution by the new rulers. These fears are not totally unfounded. There have been reports of revenge attacks against Alawites, particularly in the coastal regions where they are most numerous. It was reported by the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights that on January 31st, 10 civilians, including a child and an elderly woman, were killed by masked gunmen in the predominantly Alawite village of Alza in Hama province. Ethnic and religious minorities shouldn't be forced to abandon their identity, but Syria's transitional government should ensure that the country isn't divided along sectarian lines.
But I think, the hope is that there will be political parties that will be created and that they will have enough time to form and gain a support base. And hopefully those political parties fall along the lines of different policies to make Syria a more flourishing and vibrant and inclusive place, rather than fall along sort of sectarian or ethnic lines the way that we've seen in neighboring countries, which has not boded well for the future of those economies or societies.
The current transitional government is still finding its footing. There is a hope that they will be able to steady the country and lead it to an inclusive and representative constitution and free and fair elections. It's a mighty undertaking, but state building is not the country's only problem. Syria's economy is in a dire state. The war, obviously, did a great deal of damage, but so did the former Assad regime. They oversaw a vast network of monopolies, theft and corruption. While those at the top filled their pockets and foreign bank accounts, the rest of society struggled to make ends meet. As previously mentioned, today around 90% of the population lives under the poverty line. But a lack of access to food is not the only problem.
The main challenge today faced by most Syrians is their inability to access their Syrian pound savings and to collect their salaries in Syrian pound.
This is Jihad Yazigi, economist and editor-in-chief of economics publication, The Syria Report.
There is a cash shortage in Syrian pounds. There is no clear explanation for that. What we know is that the deposits of private banks and state banks in the central bank of Syria are more or less blocked. And so commercial banks are handing over money to their depositors only on a case-by-case basis. So one of the main challenges today for the average Syrians is to get hold of their Syrian pounds.
The liquidity crisis in Syria is another serious problem to add to the list. The little money that Syrian families do have in the bank is difficult to get. But why? Where's all the money? And why not just print more?
Printing more money does not answer the question of why there is no cash, why the central bank doesn't release the cash. Usually when you print money, the main objective of printing new money is to replace old notes, which are not usable anymore. And in addition to that, increase a bit money supplies. But if you increase it too much, you generate inflation. So the printing more money doesn't solve the issue of why there is no cash in hand. And the central bank has not been communicating, and the commercial banks we have talked to do not know why the central bank is holding their deposits. So printing more money doesn't solve much at the current stage. If they were to request more money and to print more money, they would just generate inflation at this stage.
It's true to say that the civil war in Syria ended on December 8th of last year, the day that Assad left and rebels took over the capital. But the intensity of violence has been much less in recent years. It was the generally received opinion that Assad had won the war, which obviously turned out to be very wrong, and with this false assumption and less intensity in the violence, recent years have heard calls for reconstruction in Syria. Few nations were willing to foot the bill with Assad still in office. But now he's gone. So perhaps we could see greater levels of reconstruction. Firstly, what needs rebuilding?
Syria needs to rebuild large number of towns, of districts within towns. It needs to rebuild its infrastructure. It needs to rebuild its economic infrastructure, power plants, roads, and other, other similar type of infrastructure.
So pretty much everything, which all sounds expensive.
In terms of the price tag, we need to be careful about the numbers that are usually given about the cost of reconstruction. We often talk about the cost of the war on the Syrian economy, and you hear the number of $500 billion, $400 billion, $600 billion. But this number is a measure of how much the war cost the Syrian economy. It's not a measure of the value of what was destroyed, because what was destroyed represents only one part of the cost of the war. The much more significant part of the cost of the war is the impact of the war on gross domestic product, that is on economic activity. So if we were to talk about the cost of rebuilding Syria, we are talking of several dozen billion dollars, probably. We don't have a precise number.
Several dozen $billion is a lot. Who can and might pay for that?
So no one today is available to basically provide that funding. And in a way, in any case, even if large amounts of money were available today, I'm talking here of dozens of billions, Syria would not have the capacity to manage them and to spend them. So what the economy needs now in terms of reconstruction is a few $billion, which in themselves will be very difficult to collect for Syria. We are no more in a period where the World Bank, Europe, or the Gulf is willing to spend dozens of billions or billions of dollars even into any country.
The transitional government shouldn't expect any major grants for reconstruction anytime soon. But Syria could also rebuild itself. It will take longer, but it's not impossible to get the economy going and build up the needed funds.
I think the priority for the caretaker government and for any authority in Damascus should be to first and foremost attract back the Syrian diaspora and to encourage investors who remain in Syria to invest more. You have actually already some companies operating in Syria. Wow, it was not totally a desert, if you want, before December 8, 2024. You had some companies operating. You already have some Syrian industrialists, for example, who fled the country and whose factories were taken over, who have returned and taken back their factories. But you have a large number of industries. I can think of food processing. I can think of textile. I can think of building materials, industries for which there is demand and where the investment can come into. And I think the government, the caretaker government, should support businesses in that sector.
The capacity exists in Syria. The knowledge exists and will only grow stronger as more people return. But it will be incumbent on the transitional government to unlock and encourage the economy.
I want to highlight here that before 2011, Syria had probably one of the most diverse economies in the Middle East. It had agriculture, manufacturing, it had services industry, construction, transport, tourism. It was quite diverse, actually. That's one of the strengths of this economy. So I think the caretaker government and whatever authority comes in the next few months should really capitalize on these assets.
And according to Jihad, they are trying to do that.
The good point is that they seem to be making a serious effort at talking to business actors, to economic actors more generally, listening to them, taking into account their concerns. They do understand that one key priority is to ensure steady supplies of energy products, which is a major challenge, which is probably the major challenge for business activity to restart. So I think they are trying, they are struggling, but they are trying.
The liquidity crisis is a serious hurdle. The reconstruction of both infrastructure and housing, another serious hurdle. But it doesn't end there. Sanctions. Under Assad, Syria was sanctioned heavily. And while he's gone, the sanctions remain.
Unfortunately, I don't think sanctions will be lifted. The EU has made some effort at temporarily suspending sanctions for 1 year on some items. Although we haven't implemented, actually the decision hasn't been issued yet, but they have announced that this is what they want to do. But the single most important sanction issue regarding Syria is the US sanctions on the Syrian financial industry. And as long as this is not lifted, Western banks around the world, not only Western, will not want to take the risk of doing business with Syria. And as long as they don't want to do business with Syria, financial transactions with Syria, into Syria or out of Syria, will be very complicated and costly. And unfortunately, I don't see the Americans lifting sanctions. I think the new US administration will want to use the sanction as a tool to get political concessions from the Syrian Authority, the same way, for example, they did with Sudan. Even before the fall of Bashir, they lifted sanctions on Sudan only after Sudan recognized the state of Israel. So for a political decision that was totally unrelated to the sanctions imposed on Sudan. And I think we should expect something a bit similar from the Americans.
There have been some positive steps in regards to lifting sanctions. It has been reported that both the UK and EU are set to suspend a number of sanctions on Syria. This would be a very welcome development, but while financial sanctions remain, the problems will unfortunately continue. A major hurdle when it comes to lifting sanctions lie in the transitional government. Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham is listed as a proscribed terrorist group by many Western nations, and these governments would prefer not to be seen helping terrorists. The issue of sanctions feeds into other problems we've spoken about. If the money for reconstruction does become available, where and how do you send the money if Syria doesn't have access to international banking? If a farmer wants to purchase a new tractor from a European or American manufacturer to increase food production, how do they pay? And how can it be delivered? How does the small business owner or factory owner get supplies and equipment to boost the local economy and increase production? The socio-economic struggles faced by Syrians, questions about what government will be formed and when, what will be in the constitution, and how will the economy get going again are all fundamental issues that the country is going to have to face in the coming years. There is another issue. After 14 years of war and decades of a regime that brutalized its citizens, the Syrian population is traumatized, and many are seeking answers for the heinous crimes that were committed. Natasha Hall again.
Ahmed Shara has spoken about transitional justice and national reconciliation, but he has emphasized more the latter. I think he does not want to stir up tensions sort of unnecessarily. He has said he wants to hold accountable the decision makers, quote unquote. The problem with that is that probably a lot of the decision makers have fled and are in safe places in the UAE or Russia or Iran or elsewhere. The other problem is that, the war crimes of the regime were quite ubiquitous. And I think people's daily reality of dealing with those human rights violations or even war crimes was more the soldier at the checkpoint or the judge or the mediator that was exploiting families, demanding cash for proof of life for disappeared relatives. The guy that walked around taking money from local businesses because essentially the Syrian regime had resorted to becoming a sort of a local mafia at the end.
Accusing people of a crime is one thing, but in a free and fair trial, you'd also require evidence.
One of the things that really concerns me is that evidence preservation is very critical right now. Regardless of what happens with that evidence later on, it is really necessary, not just for potential trials or Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it's necessary for families to get closure. And, what we saw after Saidnaya, people released from Saidnaya, et cetera, was really just inspiring and, depressing at the same time. But we also saw these huge logbooks of, just papers flying all over the place. Databases were stolen. I know that some people have gone into Damascus and were shocked about the records that they were allowed to see, because they're essentially a nobody, but they were sort of allowed into a room to see what are ostensibly very sensitive files. I think internationally accredited investigators and whatnot need to get in to be able to preserve that or find and preserve that evidence. That's really, essential at this point.
To further complicate things, HTS themselves have been accused of committing war crimes. A complete telling in a court of the horrors of the Syrian civil war should require Syria's new rulers to also shine a spotlight on themselves. This clip is from June 27th, 2011, recorded in the Syrian city of Hama at the start of the revolution. Cheered on and supported by the crowd, he sings, "Your legitimacy has ended, get out, Bashar." 14 years later, Bashar al-Assad is out. The Syrian people paid the ultimate price for this achievement. Millions were forced from their homes, millions fled the country in fear, and over 500,000 people were killed. No one in the country escaped the impacts of the war. It was a traumatic and disastrous time for the country and its people. But it's not the end. The difficulties will continue, could even be harder. It will now be incumbent on the transitional government to see through on the promises of the revolution, to deliver on the demands of freedom and dignity. And it will be incumbent on the Syrian people to hold the transitional government to account and not permit a backsliding of the freedoms that cost so much to achieve. The events of early December in Syria should also serve as an important reminder to everyone, not just regionally, but around the world. No matter what national leaders say, no matter what experts and podcasts tell you, even when the end has been set in stone and recorded in the history books, anything is possible. This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar El-Phil. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode shortly. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when a new episode drops. You can find a link in the show notes. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can also check out our social media accounts on Instagram and X, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X, and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis, and opinion from the region